Welcome back to the deep dive. Have you ever looked at, say, a big company spending millions, maybe billions, on security, and then they still get breached?
Yeah, or the flip side, right. A small startup ignores really clear warnings and then boom, disaster.
Exactly. And the reason uh, very often comes down to how they assess the risk.
Yeah.
Or maybe they didn't assess it at all.
And that's what we're trying to cut through today. We want to get into the systematic, informed way organizations figure out the real threats they're up against.
Right, not just acting out of paranoia or because there's budget lying around.
Precisely. We're diving into the structure that NIST, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, provides. We're looking specifically at their publications, 839 and 830.
So this isn't just theory. This is how the pros do it.
Yes, this is how organizations try to move beyond guesswork and make security spending, well, justifiable. A real business decision.
I like that. Turning security from just this, bottomless cost center into something objective. So where does this systematic approach kick off?
Well, it really starts with the big picture. Risk management, or RM, that's the overarching continuous process.
Okay, RM. So risk assessment is just one piece of that.
Exactly, a critical piece, but still just one part of a cycle. RM is all about making informed decisions based on risk.
Informed meaning taking things into account.
Yeah, informed by identifying risks, assessing them, figuring out how to respond, and then monitoring what happens. All of that while balancing the organization's own priorities, constraints, how much risk they can stomach, their risk tolerance, and of course, cost versus benefit.
So definitely not a one-time checklist kind of thing. You don't just do it and you're safe forever.
Oh, absolutely not. It's a living process. It has to be.
And NIST helps structure this continuous effort.
Yes. They break it down into four main components, sort of pillars to give it structure. Framing, assessing, responding, and monitoring. Helps make sure you cover all the bases.
Okay, let's take those one by one. Starting with framing. That sounds like setting things up, like putting a frame around the picture.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Framing is foundational. It defines the context, the boundaries for all the risk decisions you're going to make later.
So what gets defined here?
This is where you establish the overall risk management strategy. You decide how much risk the organization is actually willing to accept, and, really importantly, you set up the models and the metrics you'll use to measure risk later on. It's like setting the rules of the game before you play.
Okay, rules are set.
Mm-hmm.
Then we need to know what we're playing against. What actually is risk in this context?
Good question. At its heart, risk is basically a measure of the potential threat something faces. You figure it out by looking at two things. How likely is it that something bad will happen? And if it does happen, how bad will the impact be? The combination of likelihood and impact, that's your risk.
And for information security specifically, the something bad, the adverse event, what does that usually relate to?
It pretty much always comes back to the core principles. Losing confidentiality, integrity, or availability. You know, the CIA triad.
Right, CIA. Keep secrets secret, make sure data is accurate and trustworthy, and ensure systems are up and running when needed.
Exactly. If anything threatens one of those, keeping data secret, ensuring its integrity or system availability, then you've got a security risk you need to assess.
Okay, that clarifies the target. So after framing, we move to the assessing pillar. This is where we dig into the components of risk. I've heard it described as a triangle.
That's the classic model, yeah. The idea is that risk really only exists when three things come together. A threat event has to be able to exploit a vulnerability, and that has to lead to some kind of negative impact.
All three need to be present.
Yes. If you take away any one of those corners, the threat, the vulnerability, or the impact, the risk disappears. So managing risk is really about tackling one or more of those elements.
Okay, let's break those down. First corner, the threat. This is the potential cause of the problem.
Right. And NIST often talks about the threat source first, who or what is actually causing the threat event.
And what are the main categories there?
They generally group them into four buckets. You've got hostile attacks, like cyber attacks, or even physical ones. Then there's human error, could be accidental, could be deliberate insider stuff.
The insider threat. Always a tricky one.
Definitely. Then you have structural failures, hardware breaking down, software bugs, and finally, natural or man-made disasters, floods, fires, power outages, that kind of thing.
So, using your example, the malicious insider is a threat source. That's the who. What's the what they do?
The what is the threat event itself, the specific action. So the insider is the source, but the threat event might be, say, stealing customer data, or maybe shutting down a critical system without permission. The source is looking for an opportunity.
Which leads us to the second corner, vulnerability, the
It's
weakness.
exactly. A vulnerability is that weakness or gap in your defenses that a threat source can actually exploit.
And these often exist because security wasn't done right.
Very often, yes. It might be because a necessary security control is missing altogether, or maybe the control is there, but it's just not effective.
Can you give some concrete examples?
Sure. Obvious ones are like running an operating system that hasn't been patched in years. That's a huge vulnerability. Or using a really weak password for authentication, like that 4-letter password example.
Well, yeah, 4 letters isn't much.
Not at all. Or think architecturally, maybe having just one single web server for your whole e-commerce site and it doesn't have much capacity. That's vulnerable to being overwhelmed.
Okay, so threat source finds a vulnerability and triggers a threat event.
Yep.
If that succeeds, we land on the third corner, impact.
Right. The impact is basically how much harm is done when the event happens, the magnitude of the damage.
And how do organizations measure that? Seems like it could be fuzzy.
They try to make it concrete by using specific criteria. Common ones are, how much does it disrupt operations? What's the financial loss? How much damage to the company's reputation? Are there legal or regulatory consequences like fines? And sometimes even health and safety impacts.
You mentioned defining levels for these. Can you give us an idea of scale, say, for financial loss?
Well, it's always relative to the organization's size, but the definitions can be quite stark. For instance, in the NIST documents, an extreme financial impact might be defined as anything causing a loss of more than 40% of the organization's annual revenue.
Wow, 40%. That's
Right.
existential for most businesses.
Absolutely. It's the kind of hit that makes you question if the business can even continue.
Okay, let's tie that all together with the insider example. Walk us through the full triangle.
Sure. So, threat source, disgruntled employee, our malicious insider.
Got it.
The vulnerability they find is weak access controls on the customer database. Maybe they can get high privileges with just their regular password.
Okay, easy target.
Then the threat event is them actually copying and taking those confidential customer records.
And the impact?
It's multifaceted, right? There's the immediate potential for financial fraud using the stolen data, but there's also huge reputational damage. Customers lose trust. And probably significant regulatory fines for the data breach under privacy laws like GDPR or CCPA. That whole picture source, vulnerability, event, impact, that's the assessed risk.
That makes it much clearer than just saying we have cyber risk. Okay, so we've identified the elements. Now, how do we actually calculate a risk level? How do we move from identifying to quantifying, or at least qualifying?
Right. That's the core of the risk assessment process itself. The process involves getting ready, doing the analysis, communicating the findings effectively, and then keeping the assessment up to date.
And the results of this RA drive decisions.
Absolutely fundamental decisions. Things like, how should we design our security solutions? What should our overall security architecture look like? Does the system even get the green light, the authorization to operate? RA informs all of that.
Now, when doing the analysis, you mentioned 2 main flavors.
Yeah. Broadly speaking, there's quantitative assessment, which uses hard numbers, like saying the probability of this server failing is 0.1% per year, or this router has 99.9% uptime. You need good data for that.
Any other?
The other is qualitative, which is what we're focusing on more today. This uses descriptive ratings or categories. Think terms like very low, low, moderate, high, very high, or maybe frequencies like rare, possible, likely, frequent.
And you use qualitative when you don't have those precise numbers.
Exactly. When it's more based on expert judgment, historical trends, or when the data for a full quantitative analysis just isn't there or isn't reliable enough.
Okay, but here's the bit I find really interesting. If you're using words likely, moderate, how do you actually combine them to get a risk score? You can't just multiply likely by moderate mathematically? Isn't it still subjective?
Yes, that's the clever part of the system. You're spot on. It's not mathematical multiplication in the usual sense.
So how does it work?
We conceptualize it in 2 steps. First, you combine threat frequency and vulnerability to determine the likelihood of the threat event happening.
Okay, threat frequency times vulnerability equals likelihood.
Conceptually.
Conceptually, yes.
Yeah.
Then, second step, you combine that likelihood with the potential impact to get the final risk level.
Likelihood times impact equals risk. Again, conceptually. So how is the combination actually done, if not with math?
It's done using predefined risk tables. These tables are set up way back during the framing stage. They essentially act as lookup tables.
Lookup tables.
Yeah, so the table might say, If the threat frequency is rated likely
Mm.
and the vulnerability is rated high, then you look at the intersection in the table and it tells you the resulting likelihood is, say, high.
Ah, I see. So the subjective judgment is sort of baked into the table definitions up front?
Precisely. It formalizes the judgment and ensures everyone in the organization is using the same logic. If threat is X and vulnerability is Y, then likelihood is Z according to our agreed-upon table. It brings consistency. That is crucial. It takes it out of the realm of pure guesswork.
Okay.
Can we walk through that SYN DOS attack example you mentioned earlier?
Sure. Let's use that single e-commerce server again. We decided its limited capacity makes it highly vulnerable to a denial of service attack.
Right. High vulnerability.
Now, given how common these attacks are, we might assess the threat frequency of an SYN-DOS attack against such a server as likely.
Okay, so we look up likely threat frequency combined with high vulnerability in our first table.
And let's say our table tells us that combination results in a high likelihood for the event actually occurring.
High likelihood. Got it. Now we need the impact.
Right. So if that SYN-DOS attack succeeds and takes the server offline, maybe the company can't process any sales for a whole week. We might judge that as having a moderate impact.
Okay, moderate impact. So now we combine high likelihood and moderate impact using the second table.
Exactly. We look up high likelihood meets moderate impact in our final risk table. And let's say that intersection tells us the overall assessed risk level is medium.
Medium risk. So now the organization has a defined defensible rating for that specific risk, which they can use to prioritize.
That's the goal, a systematic way to compare different risks.
Are there other factors besides likelihood and impact that help with that prioritization?
Yes. A couple of important ones are speed of onset and aggregation.
Speed of onset, how fast it hits.
Yeah. Think about a hurricane versus an earthquake. You usually get some warning with a hurricane, days maybe. An earthquake is instantaneous. You might prioritize the risk with the faster onset, even if the potential impact is similar, because you have less time to react.
Makes sense. And aggregation.
That's about how multiple smaller risks might combine or snowball into something much bigger. Maybe several low risks in different parts of a system, when looked at together, actually create a high risk overall. You need to watch out for that compounding effect.
Okay, so we've framed, we assessed, we've used the tables, considered onset speed and aggregation. Now we have this prioritized list of risks we need to act. This brings us to the last two pillars: response and monitoring. How do managers even look at a long list of medium and high risks and decide what to do?
Yeah, a big spreadsheet isn't always the most intuitive way. That's where visualization tools come in, and the most common one is the heat map.
Heat map, I've seen those. Lots of red, yellow, green squares.
Exactly. You plot risks based on their likelihood and impact ratings. High likelihood, high impact risks land in the red zone, medium risks in yellow, low in green. It gives decision makers a really quick visual snapshot of where the biggest problems lie. They can instantly see, okay, we need to focus on these red areas first.
Very useful. So once you've identified the hot spots on the map, what are the main ways to respond to a risk? I think you mentioned 4 main strategies.
That's right. 4 basic responses. The first one sometimes surprises people. You can choose to accept the risk.
Yes, live with it.
Pretty much. Acceptance means you formally acknowledge the risk exists, but you decide not to take any specific action to change it. This usually happens if the risk level is within the organization's predefined risk tolerance, or maybe the cost to fix it is just way higher than the potential damage.
Do you give an example?
Sure. A university might accept the risk of occasional brief network slowdowns during scheduled maintenance periods. Trying to guarantee 100% uptime constantly might be incredibly expensive, so they accept that minor, predictable disruption.
Okay. What if the risk is way outside that tolerance?
Right.
Definitely not acceptable.
Then you might choose avoidance. This means you change your plans or activities to eliminate the risk altogether. You basically decide not to do the thing that causes the risk.
Like
Maybe a company was considering adopting some brand new cutting-edge networking technology, but the security assessment reveals too many unknowns and potential vulnerabilities. They might decide to just not implement it, thereby avoiding those risks entirely.
makes sense. Stay away from the danger zone. What's the third option? This feels like the most common one.
It often is. That's reduction, also called mitigation. This is where you take active steps to lower either the likelihood of the threat event happening or its impact if it does happen, or both.
So putting controls in place.
Exactly. Installing firewalls and intrusion detection systems is risk reduction. You're reducing the likelihood of a successful cyber attack. Having a backup generator reduces the impact of a power outage. It doesn't stop the outage, but it lessens the harm. Most technical security controls fall under reduction.
Okay. Accept, avoid, reduce. What's the fourth?
The fourth is transfer or sharing. This means shifting the risk, or at least part of the financial consequence, to another party.
How do you do that?
The classic example is buying insurance, like cybersecurity insurance. If you have a breach, the insurance company bears some of the financial cost. Another way is through contracts, like outsourcing. A small business might host its data with a large cloud provider. The contract likely specifies how the provider shares responsibility if something goes wrong on their end.
Okay, those four responses cover the main strategies. Once a response is chosen and implemented, say, we installed that firewall. Is that the end of it?
Not at all. That brings us to the final, crucial pillar, monitoring. This closes the loop.
Monitoring what exactly?
You need to monitor a few things. First, are the controls you implemented actually working as expected? Is that firewall still configured correctly and blocking the right things? Second, are you compliant with relevant policies or regulations? Third, has anything changed? New threats emerged, new vulnerabilities discovered in your systems. The environment is always shifting.
So monitoring feeds back into the whole process.
Absolutely. The findings from monitoring tell you if your responses are effective, if your risk assessment is still accurate, or if you need to go back and reassess or adjust your strategy. It drives continuous improvement and keeps the cycle going.
Wow. Okay, that really ties it all together. We went from framing the whole context, understanding that threat vulnerability impact triangle, using those tables to assess risk levels, visualizing with a heat map, choosing a response, accept, avoid, reduce, or transfer, and then monitoring constantly.
That's the NIST framework in a nutshell.
It really does take the mystery out of how serious organizations approach these incredibly complex security decisions. It's not random, it's a system.
It is. And, maybe a final thought to leave people with. We talk about how important those initial definitions are during framing, defining what high impact means, what likely frequency means.
By setting the baseline.
Well, think about organizational culture. How does that influence those definitions? If a company is extremely risk averse, maybe they define high impact too low or likely too broadly. They might end up seeing everything as high risk.
And waste resources on things that aren't the real top priorities.
Exactly. They might lose sight of the truly critical risks because they're trying to mitigate every minor possibility. Conversely, if they're too complacent, well, we know how that ends. So that internal calibration, understanding your actual risk posture versus what your tables say, that's a constant challenge. How much real risk knowledge gets lost if your definitions are skewed? Something to think about.